Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first Program Noted podcast at the Newark Symphony Orchestra. I am Niki Purdy, and I am your host for the podcast today. I am on the board of directors of the Newark Symphony Orchestra. I'm the chair of the Education and Outreach Committee, and I am the principal bass player in the orchestra itself. With us, we have Simeone Tartaglione, who is our music director at the Newark Symphony Orchestra, as well as the head of orchestral instruments and conducting at Catholic University. We also have Professor Russell Murray, who is a professor of music history at the University of Delaware and is the director of the early music ensembles there and is the conductor of the Chesapeake Brass Band. And we also have Professor Mike Kelly, who is a professor of chemical engineering at Villanova and at Widener, where he's actually also the chair of the chemical engineering department. He's a French horn player and writes all of the program notes for the Immaculata Symphony, the Delaware County Symphony, and our very own Newark Symphony Orchestra. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we are going to talk about our upcoming concert program. We have our very first concert of the 2020-2021 concert season coming up. And it is on October 25th. And on our program is Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And I want to break that down today. Vivaldi is an interesting guy. So if we could start there, I'm just going to throw out his dates. He was born on March 4th of 1678 in Venice, Italy. And he died on the 28th of July in Vienna in 1741. So he's a Baroque composer. And what can we tell our audience about the Baroque period of music?
Well, the official dates, because we know that all these periods started on a Monday, right? And it's now the Baroque period. We usually talk about the Baroque period as going from 1600 to 1750. And that's rather convenient because we can look back at 1600 and say that's basically when the first operas were written, which was a new form that was really at the heart of a lot of Baroque music. And it died with Bach in 1750. But it's a really central period for the development of a lot of things that we take for granted. And we'll talk about this. For example, the whole idea that concerto grows out of the Baroque.
Awesome.
I would like to add to that I consider there being two major composers from the Baroque era. Everybody knows Bach. Vivaldi is just barely behind him in terms of the development that he put into music by what he did. My thoughts.
Absolutely, I agree. Simeone, from a player's perspective, from a conductor's perspective, what considerations do you have to take in when you're preparing a piece?
As a conductor, you always need to know a little bit of history, how things were done in a certain time, what kind of instrument, especially if you talk about early music, were used, what kind of sound we can imagine, what kind of bowings would be more appropriate. So in a situation like that, for example, I want to make sure to explain the players, even if we are not using period instruments, we need to try to simulate as much as possible the kind of sound that Vivaldi was used to hear. At that time, the Baroque typical bow was completely different than the one we have today. Today we can go wonderful on the string, long note, and very powerful. The strings were also different. They were guts from usually lamb or other animals too, but they were much smaller sound. Of course, they broke all the time, but the sound was completely different. Also, the way that today we can play on the string long note, even when it's fast, there was not an option. The bow they had was a bow that jumped by itself. They were extremely, some of the bows, especially the short bow they had, they have very different dimensions. They were more feasible for fast and short note than we are today. So sometimes I make some little scandal in my rehearsals when I ask my players to hold the bow not in the right place, but like in the middle. So the weight is completely different. And I make them play, I don't say anything. I make them say da 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 da, and they play with a good sound and fat and kind of Tchaikovsky, Dvorak kind of. And then I say, that's good, beautiful, but that's not Vivaldi. So I ask them, then move your hand, hold, and everybody say, we should play like this. Is it crazy? What is, I don't want to do a concert with that. So they are also kind of like, but then they play with this, and all of a sudden it sounds like they have a period bows, and the sound is light and fresh and again detached. And then I said, okay, look at the sound. I promise I'm not gonna make you play like this, but I need that sound. So go back to the bow where you usually have it, and now try to get that sound. That's a little, of course, a trick, but usually it really has a very good impact, because we cannot play Dvorak like Bartok or Vivaldi, even Vivaldi like Bach. So we need to have every time a little different approach. And in this today, people like Professor Murray, Russell, there, it really makes a difference, because we read what they discover, we read how, the archaeology of the instrument, and then we understand how it should sound.
Awesome, thank you. Russell, do you have anything you want to add about early instruments?
I think that's, I compliment you for doing that with your players. It can be a difficult thing to make them do something that goes against years and years and years of training.
I can only do for probably 30, 40 seconds.
Right,
Then
right.
I'm going to get in trouble, but that's enough, because they get shocked by this.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the point. There are subtle differences between a violin that was built in Vivaldi's time and a modern violin. But it really boils down to the two most important things are the bow and the strings. They change the sound, they change the articulation, they change the style. Everything revolves around that. And so if you can find a way to get them to experience that even without having the equipment, that's great.
So I'll just say, as a bass player, it requires an incredible amount of control to get the right sound for a lot of Baroque music, but especially Vivaldi, out of a modern orchestra bass. I play a gigantic 7/8 size 30-year-old Canadian orchestra bass, and it is really hard to get the right sound out of modern instruments. Venetian basses that existed when Vivaldi was composing were just much smaller. And like Simeone said, the bows were shorter, and it's just a completely different set of textures than we're used to using now with more modern music. So the Baroque period is interesting. In and of itself, it has specific textures and sounds and techniques that go along with it. I want to talk a little bit about Vivaldi himself, who he was as a person. I think he was sort of interesting. He himself was a violinist and was also a Roman Catholic priest, which was certainly not uncommon for the time. Early music largely developed in Catholicism, Russell, as I'm sure you can attest to. You want to add anything to that?
Sure, he was a priest. He was not the best of priests. He very rarely said mass, and the story is more or less that he said that he had breathing problems and it was hard for him to speak the mass. He was known as a red priest because of his red hair, but he lived a rather secular life, even though he was ordained as a priest. He spent a lot of time working in one of the orphanages, the Ospedale della Pietà in Venice, which was a really fascinating place. It was basically a home for natural children, for those from unmarried couples, and for girls specifically. And one of the things they did was to teach them music at a very, very high level, which was kind of interesting because they also had to sign a release basically that said once they were done and once they were married, they couldn't perform publicly. They could perform in the home, but they couldn't carry on a professional career. But they were joined by students who paid tuition to study in the Ospedale, and so they got these were fine players, and people came literally from all over Europe to hear their weekend concerts.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, the idea of Vivaldi writing for an orchestra of young girls, basically young orphans at this orphanage, especially because there were major orchestras in the world that didn't integrate women into them until late in the 20th century. So it's just an interesting little piece of history that a large part of his career was spent there.
One thing that I think worth to be studied is the level of virtuoso these girls had there is a borderline even more virtuoso than today. If you look some of the, not the violin concertos, of course, but look at the bassoon concertos. He wrote, I think, 27 for the, I mean, he wrote like a lot of bassoon concertos. The difficulty of the bassoon, today, our bassoonists have a lot of trouble to play that kind of pieces. They are really at the extreme, at the pinnacle of the technique today. And I had some bassoonists recently, I did one of them, and they say, I cannot imagine how they play that without the evolution of the keys we have today and all that kind of stuff. So the amount of talent that this girl had there probably was much more than the average orchestras all over Europe, in my opinion.
Well, and those concertos, most of the concertos work very well as recorder concertos, and you know that high level of virtuosity really comes through.
I would like to put one other thing about Vivaldi. He was well known as a virtuoso violinist himself. He was really, really good.
Yes. There's an account by a German, Offenbach, who was visiting Vienna or Venice, and he went to the opera to hear Vivaldi's opera, and Vivaldi was conducting, and he was also playing. And Offenbach said that he played a cadenza that frightened him. Just the level of virtuosity just completely scared him.
Yeah, he was well known in his lifetime, which was not yet a super common thing for composers to be that well known that early. He also, as Russell brought up, composed opera. He was a prolific opera composer, wrote 40 operas in his lifetime. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to?
I want to add just to probably look in perspective. It is true, of course, he was an incredible virtuoso and composer, but if you look the prolific violinistic life of that time with Corelli, Torelli, Geminiani, Locatelli, is just unbelievable. Like, you know, the explosion of especially violinistic talent and evolution is incredible. What even Giuseppe Torelli, again, somehow Vivaldi would not exist with these concertos without what Torelli did pushing and all of them had an incredible life. Like Torelli was working in, I think in Brandenburg, like where Bach was working. So they were traveling all over the place. So the information was shared in a way that today, with internet, they did all over Europe, all kinds of concerts, and they were stealing from each other the ideas. So even, I think, Arcangelo Corelli, Sonata 3, and this idea of the tutti, the concertino, typical, and the two soloists where the two violins, get the same level. That's, I think, is a way that, Vivaldi then pushed it forward to then make one. So Italy was a very prolific place. And I say that because after that was not anymore the same. No. When opera took over, it was like, again, we can say in pandemic, a virus that spread all around, and Italy lost the instrumental, fervent life they had before. We had Paganini afterwards, but basically then what was it? We didn't get anything comparable to the time of Corelli, Vivaldi, and true. All of that.
That's true.
Yeah, so Simeone, you're bringing up an interesting point about sort of the evolution of an art form. Russell, do you want to speak to maybe the evolution of the concerto?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about listening to a Vivaldi concerto is that it's really very, very different from our modern idea of a concerto, Tchaikovsky concertos, those kinds of things. And what it has to, the difference is the way the soloist interacts with the orchestra. In a 19th, 20th century concerto, what we're really dealing with is, a concerto for piano versus orchestra. There's that sense of almost a contention between the two. But with a Baroque concerto, the word concerto means to work together. When we say we work in concert with, in English comes out of that. So these concertos, the soloist was integral to the ensemble itself, not standing so much apart, but being a part of it and sort of stepping forward with the solo parts.
Interesting. Yeah, Simeone, does that still affect the way that you prepare concertos in the modern day? Do you think about that kind of thing when you prepare them?
Yes, absolutely. And in many ways affect the soloist too, because what happened in this concerto is that the solo is supposed to join the melody of the tutti, like in the old concerto grosso tradition. So some of the big tutti, the solo is supposed to be there, while you're during a big tutti in Tchaikovsky, the solo is waiting and taking some time off. In this, the solo is playing his solo and then is bringing it back. He needs to play everything else. So in that aspect, it is a completely different approach. In this particular piece, I can say that this is so unique that the programmatic aspect of this piece is really fundamental in the preparation. So in this, probably that is what affects the most with the try to have a kind of philological approach as much as possible, even without period instrument, is of course the poems and all, you know, the story that basically Vivaldi put in the music.
Yeah, so let's talk about those poems. So the Four Seasons is a set of concertos, right? It's not four movements of one concerto. It's four different concertos with 3 movements each. And they are composed to be accompanied by, or were composed and then had poems written to accompany, a set of sonnets. And that makes these pieces programmatic. It means that they have a narrative to them. And I want to throw it to Mike. If you would like to, would you give us just like a brief overview of what would you write if we were going to have a normal concert and Roxanne Rust, our business manager, was reaching out to you for program notes? What would be your headline?
Which she has done, in fact. But yes, I actually see this work as 4 separate concerti. There's a concerto about spring, there's a concerto about summer, there's a concerto about fall, there's a concerto about winter, and they all develop the same way. They all have a fast movement, a slow movement, and a spectacular ending movement. I would have sequenced them differently because to me, the way I hear the last movement, winter, is bleak. And I don't want something to end bleak. I want it to end upbeat. But he put them in calendar order and that works perfectly. Everybody knows the opening notes of spring, and probably lots of people recognize winter. The 2 movements in between are very different to me because they are both showing a different aspect of the year. The summer is very languid and placid, and the fall is like there's nothing happening until winter gets here, is how I sort of read it. And I'd have done it differently, but that's Vivaldi. He had his things and he wanted to go with the calendar order. So that's sort of how I would arrange this. But it is clearly exactly what Russell said. The soloist is highly involved both in the playing and in the solo parts in between when the orchestra is there as well. But Vivaldi brought those 2 together so that they are not different elements, but they are similar elements. They fit. And that's the message that I would try to get across in the program notes.
Yeah, thank you. It's a masterful cycle. I think when they're performed all together in full. You brought up sort of the way that spring and winter are written is very different from the way that summer and fall are written. And right. The summer concerto does not rejoice in, summer is my favorite season, it doesn't rejoice in the heat of the summer, it languishes, right? Yeah, and so
in Italy there was no air conditioning.
Right, it's a
no air conditioning even now.
Go to the beach and absorb it.
You know, it's so hot that you are just, you know, you just are there, you know,
there's no way to take a break from the heat. Absolutely.
Humid and hot. It's terrible.
Probably. So I want to read the spring poem. So just before I jump in, there is controversy, although less so these days, about where these poems originally came from. Technically, we don't know who wrote them. What are you guys' opinions? Do you think it was Vivaldi? Does it matter?
It doesn't matter.
I think, I don't know if he wrote it, but I think there was a very close connection.
Oh, yeah.
Because I feel and one of the example is that, for example, in Spring, in the second movement, when he writes to the violas, that needs to be so loud and strappato, so kind of harsh. That's very strange. Why you're going to do something like that in the middle? You need to pom. Your musical is completely out of context to play sempre forte strappato. If you read the poem, right there say, this is the dog barking while the shepherd is sleeping. And I think that makes a connection that is hard to, either is not true that Vivaldi wrote sempre strappato e sempre forte, but if it's true, as at least my critical edition tells me, I think is one of the examples that I think Vivaldi and these poems are more connected that unfortunately we approve of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let me read an excerpt from Spring. So we're gonna talk about that. So Spring, this is for the Allegro, the first movement. Spring has arrived with joy, welcomed by the birds with happy songs, and the brooks, amidst gentle breezes, murmur sweetly as they flow. The sky is capped in black, and thunder and lightning herald a storm. When they fall silent, the birds take up again their delightful songs. And then for the second movement, and in the pleasant blossom-filled meadow, to the gentle murmur of leaves and plants, the goatherd sleeps, his faithful dog beside him. And finally, for the second allegro, the final movement, to the merry sounds of a rustic bagpipe, nymphs and shepherds dance in their beloved spot when spring appears in splendor. So as Simeone was talking about, there's these references in the piece itself to these moments in the poem, that moment with the dog in the viola section, right? In Spring. Are there other moments in this piece that really stand out as being derived from the poems?
Oh, I think, yeah.
In Autumn, in the first movement, after the peasant dance, and the poem says that Bacchus's wine flowed freely, and wherever it came from, the word ubriaco is in the score. The violinist is drunk, so it provides all these, what they would have done anyway, which is a carryover from an older kind of freedom called sprezzatura, this kind of really easily just make things go whichever way they want. It works really well if you've got a couple of glasses of wine in you, I think.
And it works very well if the violinists are actually drunk.
What's that?
It works well if the violinists have had some wine.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to say the violinists are happy with being lightheaded and above the world because of what they've had to do.
Oh yeah, there's a great recording by Fabio Biondi, and he really takes that to heart. It's quite amazing.
Now, I'm not sure about that, so I don't encourage my players to do anything like that because they start to be a little bit.
You don't have to encourage
when
them.
it gets fast, it's gonna. But the way I try to, that's a very good example. How I make that part to match the music. So in that specific place, there are some A notes, di, ra, ra, ri, ra, ra. So if I conduct that all in tempo, it's gonna be a good military march of somebody who is. So what I'm doing there, I'm gonna push the tempo and play a little bit like pushing and pulling in a way that players don't like at first. They think it's crazy. I say, no, it's not crazy, it's drunk. Yeah. So that's another example where you cannot just looking at this poem, it's so details, it's so close. In very fine details that you cannot ignore. And if you ignore, actually, you are not conducting Vivaldi for season. You make your own arrangement of a different piece, but you cannot tell you are playing Vivaldi for season.
Interesting. Yeah, it's I have fond memories of the very first classical music I ever remember hearing was the Four Seasons. My want to say it was my dad's mother had a cassette of the Four Seasons, a set of them. And I remember listening to them with her. They're such distinct pieces with such famous melodies and movements to them. And they all revolve around these poems. So we are going to have an interesting feature to our first concert. Simeone, you could jump in here and help me out with this, but we are going to have our timpanist, Sam Furman, do a sort of live commenting on the concert, I believe. Is this correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, excellent. To direct the audience as to what's going on in the music as it relates to the poems, which I think is going to add a really interesting element to listeners, especially to for people who are familiar with these pieces already, but maybe not with the poetry itself. So that's going to be really exciting. Simeone, talk to me about the preparation of the piece as it's happening this year. So I don't want to dwell too much on the current constraints of what's going on in the world, but we are in the middle of a pandemic and we are rehearsing the Four Seasons outside. So What has that been like?
So it's different. In many ways, it makes everything fresher, like the first time you are doing it. Of course, the joy of being sitting together now after such a long time from March makes this even more sweet. So in that aspect, it's beautiful to be together. Of course, we are all outside, so sometimes it gets really cold. And when it rains, we need to cancel the rehearsal, do a Zoom rehearsal for what a Zoom rehearsal really can be. And so that there are no winds and brass in our concerts for now. So that changed the nature of a symphony orchestra to just a string orchestra. And of course, we all have masks on. So I bought a microphone. So when I talk, they can understand what I'm saying. And I don't need to scream like crazy with this thing on. We all had the trauma of the cold temperature and the glasses getting foggy and not be able to do anything. We all had the trauma of the super cold fingers. We are thinking actually to rent or buy some propane heaters to put in between the players so we can have a little compensation of that. But I think so far, thanks also for a couple of places that host our rehearsals, the Holy Angel Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church on Possum Park Road. They were super nice in allowing us to be there because our usual rehearsal place is not available due to whatever is the situation right now. So it's exciting. Of course, we'll see what the future brings us. We hope that we're going to be back to normal as soon as possible. But I think this model of outside, except for the worst winter months, should work most of the year. So I'm encouraged and kind of optimistic from what I saw so far.
So it's almost fitting then that we're opening this season with the Four Seasons, since the concerts will all be prepared out in the seasons. Wonderful. Does anybody have anything else that they want to add? Anything about the pieces? All right. So if we are feeling good, I am going to thank our audience so much for joining us for our podcast today. We are going to have more of these in the future. Our concert again is on October the 25th. It will be at 3:00 and it will be available on our website, which is newarksymphony.org. Again, that's newarksymphony.org. And you can also donate to our orchestra there. Please consider doing so. This season, we're bringing all of our content to our audience free of charge. And it does cost to run our little nonprofit orchestra. So if you would consider donating, if you like this content, that would be great. And then additionally, on our YouTube channel, we have another series of videos coming out right now, which is our music room series. Members of our orchestra answering questions from our audience members and viewers like you about orchestra and music and what life in the orchestra is like. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.